Welcome to the IFA Global Cafe in conversation with experts. My name is Jun Wang, Special Project Officer with the IFA, and will briefly review housekeeping. We will begin this virtual cafe with opening remarks, which will be followed by a moderated question and answer session. Please use the chat function along the bottom of your screen to indicate you have any question or comment, and we will call upon you to post your question during the moderated discussion. If you have resources to share, please post them in the chat box as well. The virtual cafe is recorded and streamed live on the IFA Facebook page. The video recording and resources will be made available on the IFA's website, and you will receive a follow-up email with these resources and an invitation to the next one. Now it is my honor to introduce the IFA's Program Manager, Dr. Supriya Venigela.
Thank you, June. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's IFA Global Cafe. As June said, my name is Supriya Venigela, Program Manager with the IFA. Today, I have the distinct honor to introduce to you our expert speakers for the cafe, one of whom I met 6 years ago during my time as a student at the University of Georgia. Joining us from College Station, Texas are Dr. Marcia Ory and Dr. Matthew Lee Smith. As academics in the field of aging, Drs. Ory and Smith bring their vast experience to build the case for resilience in the UN decade of healthy aging. You know, the paradox of old age is that in spite of the losses and physical declines experienced in later life, older people report contentment. While there are no universal definitions, resilience is the ability to stand up to adversity and bounce back after challenging events. Resilience does not decline with age, and older people are as resilient as younger ones, if not more so. This is especially relevant during this time of a pandemic, which has called for a public health response that builds the ability to maintain or improve a level of functional ability in the face of adversity such as losses of life and lifestyle that have been experienced. Building resilience is crucial to a life course approach to healthy aging, as well as the 4 action areas of the decade of healthy aging, which are combating ageism, age-friendly environments, integrated care, and long-term care. Understanding and building the adaptive process of resilience is key to creating an environment that enables older people to do what they have reason to value. As professors at Texas A&M University School of Public Health, as well as directors of the Texas A&M Center for Population Health and Aging, Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith's work involves the translation of research to practice and prevention and management research programs for persons with specific conditions such as Alzheimer's disease, cancer, diabetes, and mobility problems. Dr. Ory and Smith's work on emergent public health crisis, evidence-based programming for older persons across the life course, and fostering resilience makes them ideal candidates for today's conversation. And we welcome Dr. Marcia Ory and Dr. Matthew Lee Smith. Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith, the floor is now yours.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. I really appreciate that warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and start off and then pass it off to Marcia, but you know, I'm so glad we're here to talk about resilience because it's so essential and fundamental, but yet complex, and I think we all know that. And resilience as a concept really aligns so well with those action areas and the enablers of the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. So we're just absolutely honored to be here. And as Marcia and I will discuss, our efforts in our center really align with this global mission to promote and facilitate healthy aging by addressing health risk and inequities, introducing practical and effective interventions and solutions, and also introducing opportunities for collaboration across clinical and community settings in all sectors of a community. And as we talk about resilience, that's the key. Oftentimes resilience is placed on an individual, but really it takes a community to have resilient individuals and being able to meet all of their needs as they go through those hardships. So resilience is a word that we use really often. We use it a lot. And it's defined as a person's ability or capacity to recover from a difficulty or some type of adversity. It's mental toughness. However, we know that it's much more than that. And it's a combination of nested complex factors that really, they go with the intrinsic, individualistic person and all of their traits in terms of, in combination with so many of those nested influences across the socio-ecological framework, such as, in addition to just who you are, really, when you think about resilience, it has a lot to do with your social networks, your interpersonal connections, your communications and interactions with others, but not just the people, the organizations within the community, whether they be clinical, whether they be community-based, whether they be faith-based, whether they be the government, whether they be services. But also, even beyond that, it's the built environment, the access, the ability to be able to interact and get to those services that you need, the built environment, but also the social climate, which needs to be really structured for inclusion and service integration across those sectors so that we have continuity of care and touch points for our older adults and everybody across the life course. So resilience is, in that ability to kind of spring back, really kind of seems easier for some people than others. And I think we all talk about it. How are they able to cope with this so much better than somebody else who's experiencing something quite similar? So it somewhat raises these questions as to whether or not resilience, is learned, or if it's an inherent trait, whether it's something we're born with. And I believe we contend, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, Marcia, but I contend that resilience is not static. It's not a personality trait. Instead, it's much more of a process, something that we develop over time. And when you really think about resilience, it can be learned. You can have experiences and network supports and resources that can facilitate what we call a toolbox that you can utilize when different challenges and adversities come into your life. And so with that said, those toolboxes that we have, they get more tools, more resources over time as we go through life. And life tends to transition. As we age, life transitions occur all the time. We evolve in our roles, whether it's in our personal life, our professional life, whether or not there's transitions in your housing and where you live, that can change your social networks. You could have death of a loved one, become an empty nester, retire from the workforce. So many different types of transitions can happen, which start to change your role, your identity, your responsibilities, your views on life. And even more so as our health changes, our sensory impairment, our mobility capabilities, our just physical functioning and ability, the capacity to for well-being, as that evolves, it also means that our needs are changing. So as we have more adversity, as we're able to cope with more things, as we have more experience with challenges, we seem to be better at dealing with new challenges that lie ahead. But it also means that our needs are changing, so we need a deeper, more equipped toolbox, and we need to continually be building that toolbox. So there are huge opportunities to introduce processes of resilience, and it's not just on the individual. Like I said, it's not just an individual responsible for resilience. We need to build the communities capable of supporting individuals as they have those hardships. So when you think about some of the processes and what resilience really takes, and there's aspects of this across the entire spectrum of resilience, of challenge, we think about self-reflection, understanding yourself, understanding what the issue is, understanding, truly how it is that is impacting my life and what it's going to do to disrupt my well-being. But then you have to learn coping skills. You have to understand what's in your control, what's out of your control, why these things are happening. You need to have an inventory of all of your assets and resources, your networks. But then you need to learn self-management. and you need to have ongoing supports. And then as those things evolve, as the condition starts to, level out or change, or you start to cope and adapt to it, you need to reassess where you are. What other resources do you need? What other resources can you be provided? How else can we help an individual to grow and to get back, to spring back, to have that toughness? And so with that said, there are so many different ways that we think about resilience across the socioecological framework when we talk about the programs, the resources, the services that we can provide to individuals so that we can help them live their best and desired life. And so when we think about this, we oftentimes think about all of the interventions, the trainings, the programs that we can help with. And in our work, we do so much with, for example, evidence-based programming. What we've learned during the pandemic is that some research has shown that older adults have actually been a bit more resilient and have coped with their emotional well-being better than their younger counterparts. We thought, and we all know, older adults had more challenges and were more susceptible to the lockdowns, the isolation, all of these aspects as the pandemic pressed on. But what we're learning is that they actually had maybe a deeper toolbox. Maybe their point of views, the way that they were viewing this issue, this hardship, these restrictions was protective in nature because they had already coped with other hardships. They had better resilience, more tools in their kit. And that could be attributed to them developing those coping skills over a lifetime and thinking of, where they are in their life and the amount of time they have left and how they want to spend that. Maybe they have a better understanding of the things that are outside of their control and they don't dwell on those aspects. Or maybe they just focus on the things that have more meaning and not the smaller menial types of things. So with that said, I'm just opening the floor, but what I really want to do is turn it over to Marcia to just speak more about the factors associated with healthy aging and the things that we can do. Marcia.
Thank you so much. I'm also delighted to be here. And I think we all know that you just don't wake up one day and you are old, but rather it's a culmination of everything you're doing over a lifetime. So if you want to promote healthy aging, you have to understand those factors that are really determinants of healthy aging. So we all say, and traditionally people thought it was a lot about genetics. We do know when you talk about resilience, there is a genetic component, but that's very small. Healthy aging and the way you are resilient or not is also based on your lifestyles, the way you think. And then, as Matthew said, the environment is so important. It's just not the physical environment, but it's also the social environment. So what I'd like to do is just sort of reiterate those 4 actions of the decade of aging and show how they help support resilience. The first one I think is so important is combating ageism. We all know that it's still here, it's still prevalent. It's so good that agencies across the world are dealing with it. But why it's so important is the way you think can really determine your health, whether it's your mental or your physical health. And in some studies, it's been shown to reduce your longevity by 7.5 years. So we have to keep rethinking aging. The second, again, is the built environment. And Matthew and I do a lot of work with our colleagues in architecture about the built environment. So there's a multitude of ways that the environment can influence your health. But one of the things we're learning is that the environment seems to have a greater impact on older people. So again, if you're thinking about resilience, it's how that environment can be supportive. So what we really like is this concept of universal design. It's not young versus old, but how can the environment support people, whether they're 8 years old or whether they're 80 years old. Integrated care is talked about a lot, the importance of healthcare and having it be integrated. We're really pleased in the US, there's this whole movement that's called age-friendly healthcare, where not only hospitals have come together, but they've come together with foundations to try to transform healthcare so that there's a concern about what matters to the patient. The patient now is driving healthcare. It's a better concern about medications, and older people too often on many medications and they're not coordinated. Or it's a concern about mentation, the importance of cognition, as well as other kinds of things. So that's the environment. But long-term care, I think, is also important for resilience. I think traditionally long-term care was viewed as the end of life, almost in a warehousing fashion. But what we're learning is the importance of understanding the person, providing dignity and respect. So at all stages of life, there's the idea that resilience is important and also support for resilience. So I think that those 4-decade actions all are important for building, promoting resilience. But the key to me is really collaboration. And it's what Matthew said. It's everyone working together. It's the individual, but individuals live within families and social units, communities, policy, the environment. Aging is everyone's business. Everyone's doing it. So it's everyone's responsibility. Resilience, we think, is important. It's part of it is intrinsic. A part of it can be learned, but communities also have to be supportive. So I think we're about at the 15-minute mark. So do you have any concluding comments, Matthew, before we open it up for a discussion?
Absolutely. And Marcia, always so insightful. And I love the tie back. I think, one of the things that I think about in terms of resilience and having communities for resilience is really what we can do in our organizations as we work with and serve older adults in their networks. And a lot of that comes down to the recognition that there is a problem, there is an issue. How do we identify that issue, that older adults need something? They're not supposed to be resilient on their own. They need the support. So how do we identify those individuals? How do we identify the appropriate supports for them? Make linkages. If we don't serve, if we don't offer, if we don't do that, who of our partners, who in our communities do? And then how do we follow up with them to make sure that they have that ongoing? So that continuity of care and how that looks across so many of these different sectors, depending on who the older adult is, what the adversity is, and what it is that we're really trying to accomplish.
The only thing I would just end with is we do have a toolbox. And Matthew and I always stress the importance for research to practice. We know what will help, but sometimes we don't implement it. So it's really urging us to take those best practices that we know and put them into community settings so they can benefit all older people, their families, their communities.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith, for sharing your work regarding and within resilience as it relates to health outcomes and public health interventions. As there's a question here already. All right, so I'll call upon Armin Weinberg to please pose your question.
I better unmute. I guess the question that first comes to my mind is, what role do employers have in preparing transitions from employment to after work, or as I say, selective engagement?
Do you know, Armin, Matthew and I are in a department of environmental and occupational health. So we really see the important role that industry, employment can play. And I think they're getting smarter. They're understanding that you just don't have somebody work for 20 years and then they work one day and they're gone the next. So I think it's building those expectations of what will happen after work. It's having more activated human resource organizations. So I think the larger companies are sort of having planned retirement. So you don't work one day and then the next day you're doing nothing.
And if I could add to that a little, I think that there are some innovative organizations that are recognizing this earlier, meaning that they're engaging those individuals who aren't quite retirement age. They're going younger and younger so that they can show that organizational support and having that positive commitment to their employee base, which then makes happier, healthier, productive workers who will then stay on, maybe even retain, so that that brain drain or that premature departure from the workforce or turnover doesn't occur, which then has those positive benefits as they transition to retirement.
And you, Armin, are a perfect example of healthy retirement, because I don't think you were ever going to be retired.
Thank you, Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith. There is a question here from Ms. Catherine Klein. Catherine, would you like to put forward your question, please?
Sure, thank you very much. I do want to just quickly add that a colleague of mine's daughter is retiring from the Foreign Service, and I was intrigued that they offer her several months of required sort of transitional. But my question was based on what you just said. Let me just see. What are the best practices you talked about that are put into communities? Can you share a few of those that you have learned about?
In terms of building resilience at the community level, we've all talked about the important concepts of social isolation and loneliness. And Matthew's really expert in this area. And so I think governments are recognizing this. So how about let's hearing some ideas?
Certainly. Well, you know, even beyond social isolation and loneliness, I think some of the best practices that we've been experiencing, you know, the key is that we're starting to understand that one organization, one entity, one sector cannot do it all. So the importance of collaboration. Well, collaboration looks differently depending on the two organizations involved, whether it's clinical, community, two community organizations, et cetera, but also depending on where they are geographically over time and space. So with that, what we have been really learning about are the ways that we can have complementary services and programs and identifiable referral systems that make sense for data sharing, for patient sharing, participant sharing, really having that integration. So one of the best practices is really doing brief screeners in clinical settings and community settings, and then being able to create those referral patterns to community organizations, other organizations, so that they can start to get into what we know works. It's one thing to develop something new, and we always need innovation as society changes, but the reality is we know what works. We just need to get it into the hands of the people who need it. And we need to implement it with effectiveness and fidelity and efficiency. So these evidence-based programs for older adults host a wide array of different topics that can help with resilience specifically. But think about chronic disease self-management, learning about the problem solving, the action planning, the goal setting. Those types of things alone help with resilience so that you can prepare for your condition as a new one occurs, as the symptomology advances, as new things come your way. Even with falls prevention, you think about these evidence-based programs where you can have not only to prevent a fall, but to manage one if it does happen. That's part of resilience. That's being prepared and having your toolbox. So these touch points between organizations, but also having the right types of services, programming, and solutions is really a big part of it. And I hope, Catherine, that was a piece of your answer.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Dr. Ory. There is a question here from Erica Dar. And Erica, would you like to please come forward?
Yeah, thank you, Supriya. Matthew, my question is, have you done any work or is there any evidence on the role of gender? Is there a difference given women's roles in society as homemakers and the family? Is it in our DNA to sort of, because we're so used to multitasking, have you done any work on that? Is there anything that you can speak to in terms of gender?
Erica, that is a wonderful question. And personally, I have not done any of that work, so I don't want to speak out of turn. Marcia, anything that you know?
No, I think we do know that women play a very large role in healthcare, whether it's for themselves or their families. So it's that experience that we were talking about of coping. What happens when your child's sick? What happens as you grow older, as you are the person taking care for others? So I think women in traditionally caregiving roles have learned coping and adaptation and flexibility. So I'm sure that someone is doing research on this. It makes sense, the hypothesis that you're saying, given the roles that women often take in society, that they would have good coping skills. But it's not to say that men can have good coping skills and can learn those too.
Absolutely, Dr. Ory. And, you were talking about faith-based interventions and how important they are to an individual. And there's a question here from Roddy de Guzman. And Roddy, do you want to ask your question, please?
Thank you. Yes. What I was thinking, the question is, does their spirituality play a role in resilience? And by spirituality, I do not necessarily mean being religious or belonging to a religious group. And if it does have a role, how can this be developed, and how can others like family and community help older people develop this? Thank you.
Matthew, you're on mute, but mindfulness is so important. The way that you think, what you see is meaningful in life. And I think spirituality is what gives many people meaning and purpose in life. And in that way, it's a perfect way to foster resilience.
I agree with you completely. And I think the other thing is that where spirituality comes to play actually focuses on many of these aspects that resilience relies upon. So when you think about it, that self-reflection, that's a large part of it, but also just by the institutions of religious organizations and faith-based groups, there are supports. So there is a community, there are interaction points. There's also philanthropic activities and coming together as community, but also follow-up, because there's time-based continuity, follow-up. So all of those pieces. So to be able to grow and nurture those, you can imagine it's kind of identifying which individuals can really, how do you identify them? So faith-based being a place and a mechanism, but the spirituality itself being a skill and a tool in that toolbox.
And I think what it does, it promotes sort of looking outside of yourself too. So if you think of spirituality and religious institutions, it's that giving of others to others. And I think that's another important ingredient. So it's not just yourself, but it's yourself and the people around you, and the gratitude you have for what you do, but also what you can share with others.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ory. We spoke about social isolation. For older people living with chronic conditions, what are your recommendations for increasing social engagement? Or can you make a comment on the kind of support that they need?
Yeah, I'll start on this just a little bit, but social connections are so very important, and they're important for everybody at all ages. So it's not just older adults, not just individuals with chronic conditions. Certainly everybody needs meaningful interactions, and that's the key, meaningful interactions. It's one thing to go ahead and be surrounded by people, but not really connect with them, not having people know what it's like to be you. But at the same time, when you think about people with chronic conditions, oftentimes they have common types of challenges, common types of symptomology, common barriers to having their best life. Well, with that said, you can start to identify with one another. So finding those individuals who can empathize, sympathize, and support is quite important. So identifying those kinds of groups, we've already talked about some of the evidence-based programs, but when you think about social engagement and social interactions, one thing is isolation. whether or not they can physically get to other people. So you now have this concept of, do they have opportunities to interact with others, whether it be technological, telephone, any kind, face-to-face? What can we do? This is very important during COVID. But beyond that, we also have not only can they have isolation, but what about the loneliness factor? Do they have a quality connection? Are they really able to engage and have that meaningful support from their network? So having enough people, having engagement with those people, but having that quality and feeling satisfaction from it. So that's where some of these programs with shared experiences, finding individuals who have common challenges and being supports for others are really the best and most meaningful. The question is that someone within your network that you can strengthen that existing relationship, or do you find new people and expand your network? And both are the right answers. I'll stop with that.
I see another question. I think it points to the importance of another decade principle, which is no population should be left out. So there's a particular question about Aboriginal seniors. And I don't think that, I know I'm not expert in this area and others are, but the whole thing we would say is there are certain principles of promoting resilience, and they need to be matched to particular populations and settings. So it's the people within those settings who are probably best prepared to understand how to make those connections that Matthew just talked about. But you don't want to, I think the key is you don't want to leave any population out. You can learn from others, but you also have to have the experience of the people that you're working with. You have to listen to them. It's their voices. So something that Matthew and I would say that works in the US may or may not work for Aboriginals, but it's important to listen to what the needs are and respond in a culturally sensitive way.
Love that, Marcia. And I will also add, because I love that concept so much of listening, that also we need to work with our older adults and communities so that they can better communicate and express their needs, their wants, their desires. Sometimes they don't want to for certain reasons, so therefore they keep things inside. They don't want to be stigmatized. They don't necessarily want to be seen as fragile or maybe needing to go into a residential facility or institution, and therefore sometimes will, to their own detriment, not voice up. So listening, but also helping them to communicate.
Yeah, piggybacking off that question, with regard to underrepresented or marginalized populations, and during the course of your work within the Center for Population Health and Aging, have you identified barriers older people face when they're trying to improve their level of functional ability after a challenging event?
Yes, and I think what we would say is, one, it's never too late. So you can always sort of maintain or promote functionality. And the research that showed you can even do this with people in nursing homes. So I think we know it's never too late. And it's what we just said, it's sometimes people come to us, but as healthcare professionals, public health people, we know you also need to reach out. So you don't just wait till people come to you for help, but you set up systems of reaching out. Outreach is so important, and that's really a watchword in public health.
And I would also contribute that sometimes these barriers are really based on those social determinants of health that we all know, not only based on, affluence and socioeconomic status and the ability to get the resources and the services you need, but having healthcare access and quality healthcare access. It's not just having it, it's having good care. And then of course we, especially in Texas, but in the very large country of the US, we have a lot of rural areas. So things are very dispersed. And if you don't drive, you don't have the internet or broadband, you don't have a network around you physically, or the services organizations in your community, lots of barriers start to exist. So innovative solutions are needed.
And one of the innovative solutions we're doing are autonomous vehicles. So we're working in a rural community with older adults. And we're using autonomous vehicles for two reasons. One, for taxi service, so you can get to healthcare appointments or even to the grocery store to visit your friends. And two, to have telemedicine, so you can call up an autonomous vehicle that will take you someplace or serve as a telehealth appointment. And I think it's the way in which technology is changing. But technology isn't the only solution, it's just part of the solution.
You're right, absolutely, Dr. Ory. There's a question here from Lori Lindberg. Lori, would you like to please come forward and ask your question?
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Lori Lindberg. I work at the Gerontological Society of America. So I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Smith and Dr. Ory for being members of GSA. I work on the Reframing Aging Initiative, and we work a lot with how we talk about issues around aging and how that affects how people understand the issues. So I was interested with your work with the individual, and obviously you do research with the individual, and clearly that's key with resilience. But your emphasis on solutions being rooted in collaboration and community is fascinating. Have you had issues with the research community or the field of aging in terms of pushback on this, in terms of not blaming the individual and instead looking to the community for solutions?
You know, we're in public health, so we take a very community approach, but you just can't say community. You have to build trust. And so I think the way to avoid pushback is using that L word, the listening word, to know who in the community are the key stakeholders, and listening to what their opinions are. And bringing people together from different sectors. So whether it's civil society or it's government or it's aging organizations, it's listening to communities. But you're right. Right now, there's a lack of trust in communities, and we talk about that with vaccinations. So it's being in those communities, listening and understanding. And so, Matthew, your experiences too?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, you know, there's pros and cons with all of these approaches. You know, I think a lot of times when we talk about collaboration and building partnership, unfortunately, you're doing it brick by brick by brick. Well, now that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and everyone's doing it on their own. So you might be building the same silos, but now all of a sudden, not everyone's communicating. So in a community, there are so many more coalitions, task forces, action alliances, whatever you call them, that are starting to synergize and bringing together those stakeholders for a common vision, and hopefully start to harmonize some of the activities that you would like to do for your community. Well, then, like Marcia's saying, you have some of those elements of trust because maybe the right organization needs to get to the right individual and population group. But the problem sometimes becomes, well, who's left holding the bag? Who's going to actually do the work? Who's going to financially support this work? Because we're all together in this. Do you pass the plate around? How do you make this a reality? So sometimes while this sounds very, you know, altruistic and very actionable, it's challenged in the logistics. So sometimes even those one-on-one partnerships can be labored, but they happen, they're tangible. Where sometimes when groups come together, which is idealistic, it's wonderful, but sometimes action doesn't always happen or it's punctuated.
Right. So we have spent a lot of time trying to build bridges across the aging services network, for example, in public health. And federal agencies such as yourself have been working on this, and it's not easy, but it's that recognition of bringing those different groups together who do have a common goal, and to break down the silo and to give each of the groups and communities sort of recognition for what they're doing. So they'll work together, and it's not mine versus yours, but it's ours together.
And Marcia, we have been successful, and I know others have too, of when bringing together new organizations, whether they've already been familiar with each other and have worked together or not, finding something small, bite-sized that you can do, show success, understand each other's pros, cons, what they contribute, work out the kinks so that you can then go to the next thing, grow and expand. But starting off realistic and showing success is usually the best way to get a lot of energy and other support for any kind of intervention.
Absolutely. And thank you for the
Definitely.
excellent work you're doing on reframing aging. Thumbs up to you.
Thank you. You know, we have time for 3 more questions, and I'll call on Eileen from Ireland to please pose your comment and your question, please.
Thank you very much, to both speakers. I just put in a question about, has either of you been involved in actually training and developing groups of individuals in resilience? Because we have just come through, when I say we, it's older persons councils in our area, a 10-week program that was called Leading Ireland's Future Together. And one of the attributes was resilience, but that is being offered by non-profit organizations to everybody. And it was just for 50 minutes at lunchtime, twice a week via Zoom over the COVID period. And it was excellent, but it's going out to youth groups, families, and everybody. Have you done anything like that for older people?
You know, personally, I will say that I have not done programming specific to resilience. However, so many of these programs have elements of resilience. And I think part of it comes down to, you know, where resilience comes in oftentimes is in workplaces and also with youth, with social emotional learning is oftentimes built in. But when we really think about some of these other interventions, resilience by itself is phenomenal, but it's oftentimes tied to something else. So whether it's chronic disease, whether it's, you know, fall prevention, whether it's physical activity or nutrition, whether it's medication management, whether there's some way of getting in. So, you know, the resilience training, and I really commend you on great work with that, is now starting to emerge more and more. In the US and other places, we see resilience as part of a larger, broader social emotional risk profile. So whether it's isolation, loneliness, depression, anxiety, negative affect, resilience, it all comes together. So therefore it can all be addressed, and hopefully in a way that actually influences more and gives more skills.
Yeah. So we love what Ireland is doing, but I think, you know, our experience has been resilience as part of other programs. I do know, but we're not doing them. There are some programs specifically toward resilience. They're not within our bailiwick, though.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, it was actually part of a program that included personal development skills like listening, positive attitude, respect, competence, empathy, accountability, and honesty. They determined what it was, but it was very much at a personal development level, brought together by people involved in a group, but it's been spread out and not within a medical or chronic illness, and it was for all ages. But thank you very much for your responses.
Thank you, Eileen. And we have a question from next week's speaker, Dr. Sharon Beery. Dr. Beery, would you like to come forward and pose your question?
I was just curious, like resilience is developed over time. And as a working older woman, what role do you think employers play in helping to foster that resilience and that transition? One, when they're actually still working and don't plan on retiring, and then two, you know, when they want to make that transition to retirement. Because it could have technically a negative effect on them if it's not, I think, done well. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on
this is an excellent book. Yeah, this is an excellent bookend, because I think we started off talking about the importance of the workplace. So I think we'd probably just reiterate what we said before, that the workplaces are changing. Big organizations want their workers to be happy. They want to be able to retain their workers. And as a result, they're recognizing it's not just what you can do for me, what an organization can do to build a workplace where the workers are fulfilled, they can adapt to different situations. So I think that in workplaces, just like we talked about in Ireland, I think there's more recognition and then opportunity for development.
Thank you.
And doing that earlier and building it as a part from even onboarding. So it's not just because you're starting to transition out of the workforce, it's really making it part of the environmental culture.
Yeah, thank you.
And there's
very
this
much.
whole movement called healthy workers that I think is being promoted in
Total
workplaces
health.
in the US. Pardon?
Total health.
Yeah, total. It's called total health.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's because there's a lot of, especially for older working women, there is that transition. There's a lot of different roles that women play in the employment arena and in the family side. So the stress and pressure, and I think resilience is a very key factor in that. So thank you very much for the chat today.
Absolutely.
Great.
It has certainly been our pleasure to be able to speak with you and to hear what you think and to be able to sort of have this exchange back and forth.
Agreed.
And it's IFA's honor to have you both. There's lots of engagement in the chat, as you can see, which is great. We have time for one final question, and there's a question here from Colette Browning. Colette, would you like to please come forward and pose your question?
Sure, I would. And hi, Matthew and Marcia. Lovely to see you online. It really follows up from some earlier commentary about resilience and whether we can train resilience. And, I'm a psychologist and we often assume we can train resilience. However, a lot of the social factors that impact on resilience are important. And in both, I'm probably know from my accent, I'm from Australia. So in both Australia and the US, we have, groups who are socially disadvantaged. And in Australia, we have very good social safety nets for older people in terms of access to care. However, we still see, things like the impact of poverty on communities. And I think we often assume we can train resilience, but we neglect the other social factors that are driving our ability to be resilient. And, in Australia, we've had, as well as COVID, we've had bushfires, floods, you name it. And so there's a lot of work being done now around, looking at particularly people who are socially disadvantaged and how we can build resilience in communities. So I was just making a reflection and wondered what you and Matthew thought about that.
I think you're absolutely right, Colette. You can focus on the individual, but if you don't look at the social determinants that are surrounding the individual, you're not going to have as big of an impact. So just having a course about development is going to be good, but if people are having problems with basic needs, housing, economic instability, that's going to make it more difficult to be resilient. So you have to sort of push on all of those spheres. I think that's what Matthew talked about. So I'm going to give Matthew the last word.
Well, Colette, I love hearing from you. It's wonderful to hear you. And I completely agree with what Marcia just said. I think, part of this is also that if you don't start to address the actual upstream determinants, then basically you're always going to have this constant flux. You're never going to, you can try to band-aid, you can try to fix, but they're always going to be in flux. Your community can't really thrive that way. So there's going to be a lot of ongoing ramification of that. So I thank you for raising that point. But
thank you. And thank you for a great talk. Really, really have enjoyed the talk and hearing from other people from around the world. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, as we come to the close of this cafe, I'm going to make a few closing remarks, and then we will come back to you, Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith, for final comments. First, I would like to thank you for joining us so early in the day to share your work, answer our questions, and making this an engaging session for us all. I would also like to thank the IFA staff, Ms. Jun Wang, Special Projects Officer, and Ms. Ashni Patrick, our Media Marketing Communications Officer, whose background assistance ensured the successful delivery of this cafe. Next week, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Sharon Beery, who will speak to us about global perspectives on ageism in the workplace. And she joins us from Washington, DC. And so we hope to see you all next week. And, we spoke a lot about the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, and that is a critical component of the upcoming IFA Global Conference, where we will, and it takes place between 9th and 12th November, both in person and virtually in Niagara Falls, Canada, where we will have discussions with experts and thought leaders in advocacy, brain health, vaccination, retinal diseases, and aging. And registration is open, and I encourage everyone to either attend virtually or in person. And that's it from me. And Dr. Ory and Dr. Smith, I now hand the floor over to you for takeaway messages.
My take-home message is that it's so important to think of those 4 decade of aging call to action aspects. But the one that I really like most is the combating ageism, because if you deal with that, then it will influence the way in which communities can be more age-friendly, the way in which care can be integrated, the concept of aging from birth to death. So I think all of those calls are important, but I put my money on the first one, the combating ageism.
And I think in the topic of resilience, I would just say, it really takes an entire community working together to achieve, a society free of disparity and risk and everything else that goes with it. So with that said, when we think about resilience, we might go and place that responsibility solely on the individual, but it's all of our responsibilities to do this. So everyone working together in partnership and collaboration, and it's just wonderful. We can all do it.
As we say, everyone's aging, so it should be everyone's business, and the solution has to be collective.
That's a perfect message. Thank you so much. And, and thank you for joining us for this really insightful session. And thank you to everyone for being a part of today and being so engaged and making this a really, really good Global Cafe. We will see you again next week, same time, same place, to speak with Dr. Sharon Beery. And I wish you all a very good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here.